Welcome everyone to Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and the Civil War was a catalyst of change for so many things. Why wouldn't immigration be one of those policies altered by the conflict? In the September 2021 issue of the Journal of the Civil War Era, there are a number of much anticipated articles about the Civil War and immigration. One caught my eye, and I thought my viewers would love to hear about how the Civil War changed United States immigration policy. For this video, I will be using the article by Kevin Kinney entitled The Anti-Slavery Origins of U.S. Immigration Policy. To talk about U.S. immigration policy and the Civil War's impact on it, we actually have to understand the immigration and forced immigration that was occurring around the world in the early 19th century. Not only were Africans being forced to come to the Americas as slaves, but the use of Chinese laborers has a much longer history than one might assume, because most of us are probably only familiar with Chinese immigration in the immediate post-war era when railroads were being built at a rapid pace, especially the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1847, the first Chinese workers were brought to Cuba and sold on 8-year labor contracts. Those laborers left China voluntarily, and many of them were forced to, due to starvation and indebtedness. They were taken advantage of by forcing them to work. They, in many respects, could be considered slave labor. Keep that in mind because that will come up again a little bit later. Those who voluntarily left China were coerced to sign labor contracts that they did not understand, which allowed their contract and them to be bought and sold to various employers. The Chinese were brought in to work in the sugar plantations alongside enslaved persons of African birth or descent. Around 125,000 Chinese went to Cuba over the next 25 years. As many as 95,000 Chinese were sent to Peru, where they worked on sugar plantations or cotton plantations, or they could be sent to mine guano, which would result in death after only a few years because they had to inhale poisonous fumes from the bat guano for so long and sustained periods of time. In the mid-1800s, the Chinese migrant labor population skyrocketed in the United States, with over 60,000 being present by 1870, doubling from the 1860 numbers. The contract laborers in the United States did receive somewhat better treatment or freedom, mainly because federal and state governments did not seek to enforce the labor contracts. So if a laborer ran away from their employer, they only lost their wages, not their life. However, the treatment by employers in the United States could be extreme, which concerned both anti-slavery and pro-slavery advocates prior to the Civil War. Anti-slavery advocates viewed the labor contracts of the Chinese labor migrants as just slavery by another name, and believed that acts of emancipation needed to include the Chinese. Pro-slavery advocates were concerned over Chinese laborers, but for a different reason. They feared that the use of the Chinese would undercut the value of slaves, a commodity that slave owners had a vested interest in. A Kentucky planter and future Confederate General Humphrey Marshall was U.S. Commissioner to China from 1852 to 1854, and wrote to the Secretary of State at that time that if Britain populated its colonies in the Caribbean and on the coast of South America with Chinese laborers, the effect on the slave states of the American South would be disastrous. Not only would Chinese contract laborers replace slaves in the American South, they were already being used to prompt British commercial and agricultural interest in Asia. Then there were people like one gentleman who wrote an editorial for the New York Times in 1852, who described Chinese migrant labor as the solution to the slavery debate. He stated that the cost of a slave is much more than a labor contract, and that Southern planters would come out more economically ahead if they went the route of labor contracts, and it would eventually rid the United States of slavery and the political debates that came from it. However, that mentality was short-lived and not popular. American employers, especially on the West Coast, would pay for Chinese contract laborers and transport them to the United States and other places for the purpose of gaining cheap labor. But the fact that both anti-slavery and pro-slavery supporters detested the idea of Chinese migrant laborers coming to the United States, the federal government began stepping in to stop the trade. Word about the horrible conditions aboard the ships that was reminiscent of the Middle Passage for Africans destined for slavery in the Americas horrified Americans. For example, in October 1859, the ship Flora Temple hit a reef. The captain and crew abandoned the ship, but 850 Chinese laborers were left to drown. In 1856, the newly appointed U.S. Commissioner to China, Peter Parker, no, not Spider-Man, issued a public notification to American merchants that there was to be no more transporting of Chinese migrant laborers to the United States. However, the congressional debate over legislation that limited Chinese migration was more nuanced. Yes, Southern planters did not like the idea of slavery being overturned in favor of contract laborers, but they also held to the tight belief, the long-held belief, that states controlled the movement of people. Their motivation for this states' rights debate revolved around their ability to conduct the domestic slave trade, which saw what they termed unruly slaves being sold to Deep South plantations. This forced migration across state lines and was critical to the institution of slavery, and the Southern congressmen feared that if the federal government could control the Chinese laborers, that slave labor would be next. This debate erupted in Congress, but soon after its heated debates, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States, and eventually 11 states left the Union, taking with them the votes against the regulation of the movement of peoples. With the Southern states out of the Union, now Congress could pass an act that limited the transporting of Chinese migrant laborers into the country. A congressman from Massachusetts named Thomas Eliot proposed the bill, and Congress passed it on January 15, 1862. On January 30th, Senator John Tinnock took out the phrase "against their will and without their consent" from the bill, which would exclude all Chinese from coming to the United States, the federal government defining them as unfree based on their race. On February 19, 1862, the bill was signed into law by President Lincoln, which set a significant precedent that the federal government could regulate the movement of peoples from foreign countries into the United States. The act outlawed participation by American vessels in the shipment abroad of Chinese who were held to service or labor, and authorized all American ships, not just those of the U.S. Navy, to examine and detain other American vessels suspected of transporting them. Such vessels were forfeited to the United States, and violators of the law faced fines of up to $2,000 and prison terms of up to 1 year. Of course, there were ways around the law, by appealing to the consul in China and affirming that you were a free person who voluntarily wanted to go to the United States. The Chinese population that worked for the Central Pacific Railroad to complete the Transcontinental Railroad came over legally, but the harsh conditions experienced by them and the horrible treatment by employers made Americans view all Chinese laborers as forced. This would give rise to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which forbid any Chinese from coming to the United States, and would be the basis for other immigration laws in the United States. In summation, the Civil War saw an important change in the United States immigration policy. With the Southern states out of the Union, anti-slavery politicians used their stance to get rid of forced labor of the Chinese, but this would end up leading to legislation excluding all Chinese from immigrating to the United States. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope this video helped you understand the history of immigration in the U.S. and how its Civil War origins still impact us today. Thank you all again. Have a great day.
Historian, historian, where do you roam? Historian, historian, far, far from home. Have history will travel reads the card of a man, a professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.